Okay, I'm back with part two of our session together today called Preparing Students to be Great Writers. And hopefully, you just got through examining your English Language Arts standards. And hopefully, your discussion centered around the fact that there is lots of not only requirements but opportunities for students to write in our new standards. They are responsible for things like opinion writing, information and explanatory writing, certainly narrative writing, but even as low as kindergarten, um, they are responsible for research writing. Um, in your ELA standards, you saw things like retelling stories, um, creating descriptions of characters and events, comparing and contrasting, using illustrations to expound on their ideas. And so, all of those things, though they don't have to be done in writing, there are certainly going to be times where they won't be able to um, do all of those things orally. And so, writing may be one of the work products that students are responsible for in order to show what they know. And so all of those things have to be taught explicitly. They have to be taught, the children have to be taught how to do that, to write in those genres. So hopefully you had some good discussion, and I'm going to move right on to our next slide. What Nell Duke and her colleagues said, and I should make a clarification too. I think in my opening when I showed you the book that Nell Duke and Coughlin and Jeswick and Martin wrote, I said that those were practicing teachers. I meant practicing assistant professors. But they work very closely with classroom teachers, and so that book, Reading and Writing Genre with Purpose in K-8 Classrooms, is chock full of classroom examples, real world examples of tried and true um, projects in writing that all of these ladies have studied. So, what they said in their book about a range of purposes and audiences is that when writing in compelling, communicatively meaningful environments, students will work harder, they read and write better, they learn more about the genre, they are more inclined to apply what they're learning, and they see more clearly the power of that genre and literacy in general. So, this goes back to that link between reading and writing, our studies and our writing, writing as a communication tool. And at Warsaw in particular, we've been working with performance assessments for a couple of years now. And so you're very familiar with those real world authentic tasks and the motivation that that can inspire in students. But also the type of data that you get from those work products. So this is all in alignment with things that we've already been talking about. Um, as I mentioned before, the range of purposes and audiences, those real world applications, what's interesting about real world applications is that they change over time. Our genres, in fact, our subgenres change over time. So just to say informational versus narrative or literary text is certainly not enough. There are so many subgenres within those two major categories. But even if you think about the talking heads that used to be on the news when you would watch the news at night, and you had one person kind of giving you the story, and nowadays you may have a person giving you a story that has video, that has pop ups, that has a web crawler at the bottom of the screen, and so there's all of these features that didn't exist before in that particular um, genre. So, as these genres change over time, students have to be exposed to them, certainly, but if we're going to ask them to produce different genres, they've got to be familiar with the characteristics of those genres. So, the next bullet you see there is that this requires explicit teaching of how to read and write in a particular genre. Um, there's also the third bullet on your screen says strategies for instruction should match the genre. And I've listed two here, theme scheme and collaborative strategic reading. I'm not going to go through those in depth today. I'll just talk about them briefly. They're mentioned in Nell Duke's book. But the point here is that what may work in one genre of text, reading or writing, may not work as well in another genre or subgenre of text. So when we're looking at theme scheme, for example, that works best in literature. And what theme scheme is a four-part structure where you would introduce the idea of theme to the students, you would justify its importance and describe the text theme, and then later you'd help students identify the theme themselves. And so the scaffolding that you would use would be reduced over time as the students got more comfortable. But you would, secondly, you would read the story together aloud, stopping frequently to ask questions, much like you do in interactive read aloud or read aloud with accountable talk. And then you would lead a post-reading discussion where you're going to be asking questions of the students like who the main character is, what that character's main problem was, what the character did to solve the problem, if it was a good solution or not, and if that's something that everybody should do. And then finally getting them to think about how to identify that theme in a short text on their own. And so the amount of scaffolding that you would use throughout that process would start out very heavy, where you're basically telling them what the theme is and showing them how you came to that conclusion based on the information that you were provided in the literature. But then gradually having students to do more of that on their own. And then your collaborative strategic reading is a teaching students to use 4 comprehension strategies simultaneously, where they would preview the text, um, click and clunk. In other words, they would be during reading, they would be thinking about things that were making sense and things that weren't making sense and making note of that. Getting the gist, which is basically the main idea, trying to figure out what the most important thing is, and then a wrap up. So that structure, that collaborative strategic reading structure, is going to work better with informational text, whereas theme scheme is going to work better in literature. So whatever strategies you're using for instruction need to match the genre that you're trying to teach. And that goes for both reading and for writing. You want to match those two things as closely as possible. Our last bullet here about a range of purposes and audiences is that we want to see writing across the curriculum. And I want us to look at some examples here. This is actually a 5th grade science notebook example that comes right here from Warsaw Elementary School. And I want you to notice that not only has the student used their notebook to collect information about what they're learning in science, but they're also learning about a particular genre in reading and writing. You see things like headings that they've used, these text features such as headings. You see a bulleted list that they have. You also see a graphic organizer. These are not things that you would necessarily see in literary text. So at the same time that they're learning this science content, there is a heavy emphasis on writing to learn, but they're also learning about a particular genre. The next one I want us to take a look at comes from kindergarten, and these are math journals. If you take a moment to look at those, you see that these are all about measurement. And this is in about February of the year, so we're over halfway through the year. But you notice that the students certainly are showing their knowledge of math content with words like shorter and longer, and you see their measurements that they did. But I want you to take just a minute. I want you to think, pair, share about what students are learning about writing in math. So I'm going to ask your facilitator to stop the video for just a moment and allow you time to think for just a minute, and then to partner up and to answer that question, what have students learned about writing in math? You'll see that there is a website down at the bottom where you could find more about this kindergarten lesson and how to use math journals, um, even as low in grades as kindergarten. Um, the next piece that I want us to talk about is writing in response to reading, because this is an audience and a purpose that really you're going to find primarily in a school setting. Um, so students may be writing in response to their reading for the purpose of showing their teacher what they know, or they may be doing it to collect information so that they can keep track of what they're learning. Um, but what Fontes and Pinnell say about writing in response to reading is that types of writing about reading should be taught first rather than simply assigned after a brief explanation, and we cannot take for granted that a form or genre is easy enough for students to assimilate without explicit instruction. So just asking kids to respond or write sentences, or even just teaching them sentence writing, is still not going to prepare them to be able to respond to reading the way we need them to. So they suggest a writing in response to reading, kind of a 10-step process. It sounds like a lot, but as I go through these very quickly, I want you to think about if you currently do this to help students write in response to reading, and if not, what steps maybe that you've been missing. So step one, of course, is to read the text together, and this is always when you're teaching a new type of writing in response to reading. So you're going to talk about the text together, and then you as the teacher are going to model that writing about the text in a particular genre. So let's say you've asked them to write a letter to the author. Well, they may not know what that should look like or sound like, so you're going to have to model that. Or if it's just a constructed response to reading, such as what's found in our TRC examples, or a constructed response at the end of a test that you may give, all of those are subgenres that have to be taught and modeled for students. So you're going to show other examples of writing in that same genre, and then you're going to analyze the characteristics of that genre. So you'll actually take those examples and go through with students and annotate, do things like underline the things that they notice, the patterns that they notice, the language that's used, the tone, how long it is, and all of those things, those characteristics. Step 6 is to have students work with you to create a text in the genre that you've modeled. So back to our letter example, this time instead of you modeling what it should look like, you're going to have students actually working with you to create that letter. Step 7 is have students to try writing in the genre with a partner or on their own. So this is where they get a little more independent. And then have students share their writing and reflections on the entire process. You're going to have students use the genre to respond to their own reading. So far what you've been doing is a text that you've read together, and now you're going to actually have them apply this to something that they're reading on their own. And finally, you're going to encourage the students to write in that genre several times to develop fluency. So even after all of this modeling and practice, you're not going to expect to see proficiency until they've had numerous opportunities to try to do this on their own. Very quickly, I'm going to give you your assignment. Your facilitator is going to stop the video, and you'll either have this sheet to compare writing assignments K2 or 3 through 5. And what I would like for you to do is, based on what you've learned so far about writing instruction, I want you to look at these and discuss assignment A and assignment B, and just talk specifically about how each of these assignments benefits